For those of you who don't know, my main channel, History of Everything, got its start by horrifically mocking the insanity of the modern Russian Navy. Well, modern is a relative term, basically the Russian Navy after those weird things called engines got added. Anyway, I've always said that I would come back to the Russian Navy in the Age of Sail, and well, I now co-host a literal Age of Sail channel, so here we go. The tale of the Russian brig Mercury, a genuinely competent ship at a time when the Russian naval leadership effectively sounded like Glasgow on a Tuesday night. Tsar Peter, known to history as Peter the Great, was responsible in the 17th century for the foundation of what would become known to history as nothing more than the comedy show that is the modern Russian Navy. But it wasn't always this way. See, in those crucial early years, the Emperor realised that building an effective seagoing force was not the easiest thing in the world, and that to do it properly, you had to seek out people who knew what they were doing to build the force. Thankfully for Peter, the Act of Union was in the process of being signed by England and Scotland, merging the two nations together, but the Royal Scots Navy and the Royal Navy, nominally siblings and supposedly both under command of the same monarch, made for terrible friends. If you ask an Englishman, they'll tell you quite often more than not that the Royal Scots Navy was nothing more than a joke, just a handful of ships and officers with less experience and know-how than their English Royal Navy counterparts. But this flatly just isn't true. The Scots could, and if they needed to, call upon dozens if not over 100 ships in a time of war through an extensive reserve fleet. The fact was, though, that Scotland could not afford to maintain a giant battle fleet in perpetuity, but due to laws and reserves, the Scots could, given a little time, outfit a significant fleet that could go toe-to-toe with most other European powers, save for the major powers like the English, Dutch, Spanish, French, you get the gist. One day, somebody else, a very Scottish man who likes wine and is a friend of mine and has an affinity with pigs, will probably do a much larger video on the Royal Scots Navy. But just to give you an idea, the force was essentially 5 professionally manned and operated warships and a massive reserve. This reserve included access to a very large pool of highly talented captains and professionally manned ships. Highly talented and very Scottish captains. These captains, when told they were merging into the Royal Navy and that they would be considered less senior than many of their counterparts, took the very Scottish approach of flipping the middle finger and leaving for greener pastures. Peter the Great was only too happy to offer those greener pastures, though, offering up the men titles and positions as admirals of the new Russian fleet. Over the next 50 years, these Scotsmen and their children built a navy that was second to none in skill, training, and talent. They commanded large fleets of well-built ships, and they began building programs and laid the foundations of a force that would spawn admirals such as Ushakov. It was all going so well, that is until the 19th century happened and the corrupt rot truly set in. But at the turn of that century, right before everything started to go really, really bad, there was one ship that stood up and, using all the training and skill on display in this early, completely different Russian Navy, went one-on-one with ships of the line, and won. And the catch? It was a tiny brig. The Mercury, the star of our story today, was built in Sevastopol and launched in 1820. It belonged to a small class of agile brigs intended for patrolling, reconnaissance and dispatch duties rather than frontline engagements. Ships of this sort were vital in the Black Sea Fleet, which, unlike the Baltic Fleet, operated in a relatively confined region, where Turkish ships, the only real challengers at sea, could conceivably be over the horizon at any given moment. Scouting was beyond vital for the Russians in this day and age, lest they accidentally blunder into an engagement. Designed under the influence of both Russian and Western European naval engineers too, along with their traditions, Mercury's design was explicitly centered around speed and maneuverability above all. At approximately 340 tons displacement and armed with 18 guns, typically these were 18-pound carronades and a pair of long guns, the brig was not a ship of the line, rather a very light warship capable of scouting and rapid communication. To reinforce this, she actually had a set of oars, so she could operate in basically no wind. Its shallow draft allowed it to operate close to shore near enemy ports, keeping her free from being harassed by larger ships, and fast enough, and again, has the oars, and manoeuvrable enough that she can escape any pursuers that she can't flat-out outgun with her 18-pounders. Russian historical accounts refer to repeatedly that during the brig's construction, that higher than usual attention was paid to the hull's form and quality for its rigging. I suspect this kind of record-keeping is one of those after-the-fact records to explain why, in the 1829 battle, Mercury's masts and sails had the ability to hold a precise course and, stand up against massive broadsides, rather than just giving the credit to where it was due. a good captain, and a good crew. It had to, put the success down to more design, more foresight. It's very propagandized what is about to be explained to you here, especially by the modern Russian Navy. The brig's moment of fame, and the reason I'm making this video though, came in the Russo-Turkish War of 1828 to 1829, one in a long series of conflicts between the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. At stake were issues of territorial control in the Balkans and the Caucasus, typical stuff for conflicts between these two major powers, including access to the Black Sea and influence over the Orthodox Christian populations in Ottoman rule. Usual stuff. For the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the war required near constant reconnaissance and enforcement of blockades within the Black Sea. This would ensure that the Ottomans couldn't land raiding parties, or worse, behind Russian lines on the large southern Ukrainian and Russian coastlines. The Russian fleet operated in contested waters where Ottoman frigates and ships of the line occasionally tried to break through or challenge Russian positions. Under these conditions, smaller vessels like Mercury were critical. They were sent ahead of the main fleet in little squadrons to monitor the Ottoman movements, often sailing into dangerous waters where they were more than likely to encounter enemy ships that were most likely going to be superior, and they needed that speed that we talked about before to get away. And keep in mind too, the Black Sea is an inland sea. You only have so many directions you can go to flee. By early 1829, the Ottoman command had dispatched several powerful ships to challenge Russian reconnaissance activities near the Anatolian coast. In this environment, the Mercury was assigned to a detachment under Captain Lieutenant Kornilov. But in late May 1829, it found itself temporarily separated from supporting vessels, and it was at this moment sails were spotted approaching them. A lot of sails, as two large Ottoman ships of the line had spotted the small Russian brig and moved to intercept. While the exact identity of the second Ottoman ship has been debated, one of the vessels most likely was the 110-gun Selimiye, and the second we think was the 74 Riala Bey. Either way, even if they weren't these two ships and they are later, fictitious, oh wow, look, they were bigger than they actually were, even if these two ships were frigates, they were still large three-masted vessels with rows of guns against a tiny, tiny brig. A single broadside from either of these line ships could cut the Mercury in half. Upon sighting the Ottoman ships, the captain of the Mercury, the Belarusian-born Lieutenant Kazaki, convened his officers and crew. According to later retellings, including more patriotic ones, Kazaki declared that two options existed: to fight or to blow up his ship, if defeat became inevitable. Although some details have been embellished, such as Kazaki's claims of undying loyalty to the motherland and his big speech to go with it, what remains true and well established was that he was not intending to surrender the brig. Using her size and speed to her advantage, for several hours the Mercury evaded, fought, and manoeuvred with extraordinary skill. The Ottoman ships attempted repeatedly to close the distance and rake the smaller vessel with their broadside, but Kazaki kept the brig at a sharp angle, reducing the effectiveness of enemy fire and angling his ship into the wind to use his sails and his oars to the best of his ability against the larger Turkish ships. And this worked tremendously effectively. He was able to keep the Mercury effectively out of the Turkish firing arcs. While handling his ship brilliantly, Kazaki ordered his gunners to aim at spars, masts, and rigging, essentially any vulnerable parts of the enemy ships that could reduce their pursuing speed. Contemporary reports credit Mercury with disabling key rigging elements on both Ottoman vessels, slowing them enough to prevent a successful close-range attack. Make no mistake though, the brig did not escape unharmed. Several spars were damaged, hull planks were pierced, and casualties occurred among the crew, but crucially, the vessel was able to keep its speed up and keep moving. As the engagement wore on, the wind slightly shifted in favour of the Mercury, allowing Kazaki to steer the brig towards the open sea and a nearby Russian squadron that was just over the horizon. Unable to close the distance and having suffered some rigging damage, and, likely spotting the Russian ships from their foretops, the Ottoman ships eventually broke off pursuit. Somehow this little brig had survived the odds against two larger ships. She would later return to Sevastopol battered but afloat, and greeted with astonishment and celebration by the common sailor and authorities. For their feat of bravery, Kazaki and the crew were hailed as heroes, the Russian High Command awarded medals, and the brig's officers received promotions. Kazaki himself earned the Order of St. George, but in the sign of the horrifically corrupt hellscape that was to come, his life was cut short only a few years later, in 1833, after he was poisoned. The brig itself would remain in service for 2 more decades, performing routine duties before being retired and later broken apart. Today there is a new corvette that uses the name in honour of the brig. The new Mercury is a recently completed corvette that is nominally assigned to the Black Sea Fleet. But due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, she is not permitted to enter the Black Sea under the Montreux Convention. The tale of the Russian brig Mercury was ideal for artistic celebration. After all, it is essentially David versus Goliath at sea, a small ship bravely defying mighty enemies. It's got the stuff of novels in it, fantasy, and it's perfectly open for interpretation. It's right up there with Thomas Cochrane, and the Speedy, or Jack Aubrey, and the Cacafuego. One of the most famous representations in the painting, the brig Mercury attacked by 2 Turkish ships by Ivan Obzovsky, is not exactly accurate, and Obzovsky often emphasized dramatic elements to portray emotion over fact. Like all good patriotic artists, a lot of the artwork you've seen on this brig and a lot of the artwork you see in this video is the work of pure propaganda. Other artists and numerous illustrators of naval histories have also depicted the battle, and in the digital age, the ship is actually part of the now very, very dead MMO Naval Action. It was through this game that I actually found out about the brig quite a few years ago. It is, as a side note, infuriating just how poorly this game was managed. During the late Imperial period, as things got worse for the Russian Navy and Russian royals, the story of the Mercury became part of naval education and patriotic discourse. The ship's name was used repeatedly in literature and journalism as shorthand for bravery against overwhelming odds, and this continued well into the Soviet era. Despite periodic ambivalence towards imperial symbols, the story remained popular in the history of the Russian fleet because quite simply it fit well with the values of heroism, discipline, and ingenuity. In short, it was the perfect propaganda tool and not too imperial to be tainted. Within the modern Russian state, the brig Mercury experienced a resurgence of naval interest. Naval anniversaries, historical reenactments, and maritime museums continue to celebrate its legacy, and the story is commonly taught in naval academies. It's become such a useful tool, particularly considering the state of the current Black Sea fleet, that plans have occasionally been proposed to build a replica, although where the money to do that would come from is anyone's guess. At the end of the day, while the Mercury's escape was indeed remarkable, historians note that certain later accounts embellished the details. Some romanticized descriptions inflated the size or number of Ottoman ships, portrayed Kozaki's orders in heroic actions or verse, something like out of an Odyssey, or exaggerated the brig's damage. Still, the core elements are supported by naval reports from both sides of the conflict. Mercury, a small brig, successfully engaged and escaped from 2 large Ottoman warships, most likely ships of the line, through exceptional seamanship and, as Jack Aubrey would say, damn fine gunnery. And that's it. That's the tale of the Mercury, the little brig that could, and the beginning of the end of the honeymoon period that was the early Russian Navy. It really was for the most part all downhill from here, and I can safely say it's because somebody did not choose the lesser of 2 evils.